So today we're going to be going over COVID death numbers. This is for November 5th, 2021, and this is data pulled directly from the Government Alberta websites. Introduction. I believe that the government and media are promoting a very skewed picture of COVID. So I'll be going over the data directly from the Government Alberta website, and in my opinion, COVID seems extremely benign, except for the most vulnerable age group of the 80 plus. Total number of cases. So there's been a total of 325,517 cases in Alberta, and this is from the start of the pandemic. The Alberta population is estimated to be about 4,442,879 people as of July 1st, 2021. This means only 7.3% of Albertans have gotten COVID since the beginning of the pandemic, and this doesn't even account for people who have tested positive for it multiple times. This seems like a ridiculously small number to me compared to the restrictions that have been imposed on the population. So here's a chart of total COVID cases representing 7.3%, and the rest of the population, which has been basically unaffected, of 92.7%. Total hospitalizations. There has been a total of 14,483 hospitalizations for COVID-19 since the beginning of the pandemic. This represents 0.3% of the population who have been hospitalized. If you did get COVID-19, your chances of being hospitalized move up to 4.4%, according to the Government Alberta numbers. These chances seem extremely low. So as a general person, your chances of being hospitalized are 0.3%, and even if you get diagnosed with COVID, there's only a 4.4% chance of actually having to go to the hospital for it. Here we have the chart of compared to the total population, and then we compare it to total COVID cases versus how many were actually hospitalized. Next, we move on to the ICU numbers. The Alberta government says that there's been 2,798 ICU admissions for COVID-19 since the beginning of the pandemic. This represents 0.1% of the total population. If you're diagnosed with COVID, you would have a 0.9% chance of being admitted to the ICU. If you're hospitalized from COVID, you have a 19.3% chance of being admitted to the ICU. So this is actually where the numbers start to tick up a bit. And I wonder if this is because there isn't preventative care measures being implemented. Basically, the only preventative care measure the government seems to be promoting is a vaccine, but haven't looked at like ivermectin or hydroxychloroquine or vitamin A, vitamin D, vitamin C, like any of these kind of things. It's basically just like, just stay at home until you get as sick as possible, and then if you have no other options, come to the hospital and we'll basically kind of look over you dying. So here we have the graph of ICU admissions compared to the complete total population, 0.1%. Chances of ICU admission compared to total COVID cases, 0.9%. And then here, if you actually get hospitalized for COVID, your chances of going to the ICU are 19.3%, which is significant. COVID deaths. For deaths, the data seems to diverge. There has been a total of 3,137 total COVID deaths. This is actually 339 more deaths than admissions to the ICU. So to have an accurate understanding of the risk profile of death, you'd have to do analysis by age bracket. For the 80 plus age bracket, there have been 1,693 deaths, while only 122 ICU admissions. From the age bracket of 70 to 79, there have been 713 deaths, while only 472 ICU admissions. So you see the data here. Basically, the blue side is ICU admissions, and the deaths is the red. And we have this massive spike for the 80-year-olds. So basically, these people died before, I'm guessing they even got to the hospital, or they even got to the ICU. Here again, we have more people, 70 to 79, spike of deaths. That's actually more than the ICU submissions. So it doesn't make sense that they're going to the ICU and then dying, and only a certain percentage of them. A lot of these people have already died. And then here the numbers start to make a bit more sense. But you really have to kind of look at this as two different categories, is looking at this left category and then looking at this right category. So chances of dying from COVID. So your total risk of dying from COVID is 0.1%. If you're actually diagnosed with COVID, you have a 1% chance of death. But this is for the broad numbers. So now if we actually look at this, so this is under 50 risks of COVID death. So if you're under 50, there have been 117 deaths since the beginning of the pandemic, and a total of 249,715 cases. This is a 0.05% chance of death if you get COVID for under 50 category. This group represents 76.7% of the total COVID cases. So overwhelmingly, the vast majority of COVID cases has been this under 50 category, but there's only been 117 deaths for this category. So the numbers really just don't make a whole lot of sense. And they represent 3.7%. So it's like they represent 76% of the COVID cases, but only 4%, 3.7% of the total deaths are in this category. This means there is one death for every 2,134 cases in this category. Over 50 risk of COVID deaths. For the over 50, there have been 3,018 deaths and 75,545 cases. This is a 4% chance of death if you get COVID for over 50. This group represents 23.2% of the COVID cases, and yet they represent 96.2% of the COVID deaths. This means there is one death for every 25 cases in the over 50 category. Over 50 have an 85 times greater chance of death from COVID than the under 50. And this is basically if they are both diagnosed with COVID. If you're over 50, you have 85 times greater chance of death than if you are actually under 50. And even this data is not the best because the data is really skewed. It's basically this 80 plus category. If you get COVID, it's like you have a 20% chance of death. But it's like as you start going down, I believe it's this category has like 1% chance and it just rapidly drops off. So then we go over some charts. So we have total deaths compared to the rest of the population. So it's 0.1%. Total deaths in the actual COVID cases. So this represents 1% of the COVID cases have died. Under 50 COVID cases. So basically we have the 0.05%, I believe, chance of actually dying if you have COVID for under 50. But then we look at the cases and deaths, kind of comparing. And so we have the cases here for the under 50. And the vast majority of cases are this under 50. But then you look at the deaths here, and it's 117, and you can't really even see it on this chart. Then we go over here, which is about the 76,000 deaths. And we have the 76,000 cases, and we have 3,000 deaths here. Again, these numbers just look exceedingly low for the totalitarian measures that the government's taking here. So again, I looked at the risk profile, so the 0.05% versus basically the 4% risk of dying over COVID, and this is 85 times greater. So conclusion, COVID is only being diagnosed in 7% of the population, even with massive testing. The risk of death from a COVID diagnosis is 0.05% for the under 50 age group. These numbers don't warrant the vast overreaches of power in the Alberta government, and any action that they do take should be focused on preventative measures for the most at-risk age groups. Thanks for watching.